All right, so I should be live right now. So today, guys, we're going to discuss how do you wrap scale armor to various surfaces, like you'll see here. And once this stream is finished, I will upload the blend file so you guys can, if you have any issues, you might be able to reference this and figure it out. So again, we're going to be wrapping these scales, and these scales can be various shapes. It'll work just fine with many shapes of scale. And we're going to wrap them to various surfaces. And as you can see, some of these models have their own issues. So what's happening here is, I'll just describe to you the actual modifier stack that we're using. What we do is we take, first we have, probably be better if I would start from scratch, but which we will do in a second. But actually, before I do start from scratch, I want to make one point about how the shape of scales. Two points about them, actually. First of all, many scales, they have sort of a, they're not a flat plate. They have sort of a cross-section to them. It's kind of like a triangle. You can see it in this picture right here. So if you want to be realistic, you might want to consider doing that, depending on the type of scale that you're making. The other thing is that there are multiple shapes of scales, and as you see my actual blend file, I have both triangular and rounded shapes. It's up to you which one you think looks better. Now, am I going to do the actual pattern of ropes? I could. That would be extremely, that would throw in a lot of extra vertices. And realistically, you might even want to make the scale texture, the scale model, like not in actual geometry. It might be wise to use a normal map for this type of effect and not to model the actual scales. So I'm not saying, hey, if you're making a video game character, go ahead and spend 20,000 vertices making all these scales. That's up to you. That's if that's a good idea or not is kind of specific to your context. If you're doing an animation, it might be wise to have all these scales individual and make it some sort of cool looking object or whatever. And so once again, we can wrap these scales to just about any surface. So let's go ahead and start from scratch. What we have to do, let's go ahead and center our cursor, and it actually is important to have your cursor, like the origins of your objects are important. If the origin of your, let's say your the object that goes to the array, if it's offset from the curve in the origin, it will create a weird effect. So bear that in mind, guys. So let's start the actual tutorial now. Now that I've done my whole 2 minutes of introduction. Let's start off by creating a flat plane. And this will be what our plates are spawned from. Now you might be asking yourself, why the extra step of spawning it from a plate? I'm not going to explain that right now, but trust me, there's a reason for this. And then we're going to actually duplicate this plate. Shift D. Let's go ahead and turn on screencast keys. So you can either Shift D to duplicate the plane, or just go ahead and hit Shift A and add in a new plane. Either way, now what we're going to do is actually model the shape of our scale. So I'm not going to make it like have an actual. I'm not going to go super realistic, and also I'm going to use a mirror modifier to make it a bit easier for future reference. You don't have to mirror it. That's an extra modifier. You don't have to throw that in. And we're going to have it shaped like this. So that's it's going to be facing upwards. That way they can actually overlap without colliding into each other that way. All right, so for the actual shape, it might have been wise for me to wait until let's go ahead and just put this to 0 on the axis. I should probably make the actual shape before I rotated it around. So I could just do this type of kind of sharp scale edge. All I wanted to do curve 1. What I could do instead is I could show you guys how to use proportional editing. So Control R and scroll wheel up to create more edge loops, and if I hit O, proportional editing, I drag it around, you can get a certain shape to that. And maybe you want to do like sphere. Maybe I don't know exactly what I want to do. That kind of works okay, and we could go ahead and move it backwards. Oopsies. So I would not recommend having your scale super high poly. You could add some thickness to them, which actually might look better. If you do that, I would recommend doing smooth and then edge split. That way it looks normal. Let's go ahead and up the let's do the angle upwards a little bit. Why is that not? Oh, is there an extra face here? There is an extra face in the center. That's why there's an issue with the shading. The shading was messed up right there. So, and if you're doing this as a scale, I would recommend deleting the back faces, because if you have a scale, like a scale armor, if I'm looking upwards at it, I can see these faces, and if this is a front, but I wouldn't be able to see these faces. So to delete them, it'll save you a little bit of processing power per scale, but if you multiply 10,000 scales, it's going to save you, it's going to reduce the processing load. And these top faces will also never be seen. The side ones probably wouldn't be seen either, but we'll still leave them in. So that's the scale pretty much made. I think it's a little bit thick, but you know, it's easy enough to adjust. We'll just do that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and pull this up and rotate it. And we can play around with how much rotation we have and how much, you know, later, depending on how it looks. And then what we're going to do, select this thing first, then this thing, Control P. And that's going to set selective to active, Control P to parent. And now what's going to happen is if I have an extra face for this object, if I go ahead and over here, I do duplication. This is under the object, data, whatever in the properties panel or properties menu. Duplication on faces. Now every face is going to have one of these. And why it's important is when we have an array, if I delete these faces, if we have an array, it's going to work fantastically. Now if I have 10 of them, and why it's great is I can wrap this plane to a curved surface and it won't bend the plate. The plate will remain perfectly straight even though it's spawning from something which is wrapped to a surface. Now what we're doing is we're actually going to have like two ways of wrapping. We're going to wrap these flat faces onto a curve, and the curve itself is going to be wrapped to our surface. So let's go ahead and just like create a plane, upsize it, and do a subsurf modifier, and maybe throw in 2 edge loops on each side. And let's go ahead and like do this. And in proportional editing, let's go and like pull this up. All right, so like this is not like a great looking surface, honestly, but like I did model some nicer looking things to shrink wrap it to. But we're just gonna do this as a demonstration that we can just use this as a surface to wrap things to. I could also wrap it to a cylinder. And in fact, I'll do a cylinder because that's specifically what the person was asking for help with. So let's just do that. It'll actually be more helpful to them probably. So that's SY, and then if I do S Shift X, it scales. Oh, actually S Shift Y. Let's actually make it a bit larger, given the size of our scales. All right, that looks about right. We'll go ahead and do a smooth and the edge split just to make it look better. Not that we actually need to for this tutorial. All right, so I'm gonna leave these guys where they are. Now the next step is to create a curve. So let's do Shift A and add a curve. And it would be probably useful to name this actual. So that's our actual curve that we're using. Now it starts off kind of angled, so it's rotated along the x-axis. So if I do A RX 90, it's now rotated, so it's I don't know. There's no rotation on the x-axis in a way that I don't want it. So we're gonna wrap it around like this, around the curve. This is obviously in edit mode, and you can play around with these. You actually want the curve to, you want to get it as close to the surface as possible. The shrink wrap is supposed to fix it for you, but the shrink wrap can only do so much. If I like do it out here, it's gonna kind of mess things up. You can get away with it maybe. I would just say do it right. Now here's the one thing this doesn't work great with. If you actually select these two and hit F, if we actually got further along the process, it would break the modifier stack in a way. I guess I could show you that when we get to it. So now we have to take these faces and wrap it to a curve. And actually, we can also fit the length to the curve, which I do strongly recommend. So now it's fit to the length of the curve. And then we have to add a curve modifier and specify the actual curve. And wow, we kind of are already there, right? Well, not really. We have to take these faces again. Now, also, we need to shrink wrap this curve to the surface. And it hasn't quite worked yet. Then what we also want to do, I think if you applied it, it would work. Yeah, it would kind of work, but not great, right? So what I like to do is take the flat faces again, and the faces themselves are going to be shrink wrapped to this. Now, the reason that we have the whole duplicate thing with the extra flat face, that extra step, is because if we shrink wrapped this plate, this cylinder, the plates would turn flat and it would remove their rotation, and that way they'd be flat, so they wouldn't be the right shape, and they wouldn't be offset, so they wouldn't overlap in the way that we want them to. Now, I actually kind of skipped ahead a little bit. Now, I could show you what happens if you merge these two. Well, last time it broke my... okay, I was speaking out of my butt, apparently. The last time I combined this curve to be completely cylindrical, it like flipped my faces around, which wasn't fun. So you may have that issue. I couldn't figure out why it was occurring. Anyways, so now we're actually going to change the shape of our we're going to untap the curve modifier and the shrink wrap just so we can actually see what we're doing. And we're going to go ahead and finish editing. This is the face. This is not the shield, the armor plate. With the face again, we're going to Shift D, and in edit mode, we're going to like move it down to about right here. You want to make sure it's not overlapping. So we could do about this would be right. Maybe even do it like more like this. It would look a bit nicer, I think. And then you have to reduce the relative offset so that it works properly. I think this is about right. Okay, see that's how it overlaps nicely. Now, by the way, how you can, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. What we have now is we have 2 rows of plates, which are perfectly wrapped. And we can bend out, let's go ahead and subsurf this thing. And if I like go ahead and like pull out this edge, oopsies, that's not what I wanted to do. If I go ahead and pull out one of these edges, a little bit too much, perhaps. It's still, well, the curve modifier, I first need to adjust the curve. If I go ahead and pull out one of these faces, it adjusts the length and the shape of the plates. Now, it's not perfect, and right now I think the plates are a bit too close together. So if we go ahead and increase the relative offset, you might have to play around with that a little bit, you know, depending on it. The issue is that it might not be perfect in some areas. You know, this is this will require some cleanup probably, depending on your actual use case. But now the difficult thing is, how do you make this not difficult? The issue is, depending on how you extend the length downwards, you may or may not get issues. So one way to make this plate, this whole modifier stack, whatever you want to call it, extend down further, we could just go down. Let's turn off the modifiers right here. I could take these flat faces and then duplicate them, and then I have like 2 rows, right? Now, let's see. That's actually, I think, offset too much. Is it? That looks right. And then I can do it again. And then if I see the modifiers again, now I have 4 rows of plates, and it looks pretty good. Looks okay. And again, it wouldn't have to be on a cylinder. You could wrap this to a fairly flat surface. You could wrap it to a shield or anything you wanted to. You could wrap it to a helmet if you wanted to. And there were actually, in fact, scale type helmets, which is kind of weird, but they did exist in medieval artwork. So there were examples of them. Actually, you could look up Knight Errant. He has a channel about medieval armor, and he did a discussion of a scale mail helmet, which is really weird. Anyways, so like the issue with this is that doing it this way, it's not as flexible. So if I go ahead and like do this and scale it outwards, it doesn't work as. Why is it so sharp in there? Why is that so sharp? I have subsurf on. Maybe if I do like subsurf 2, that looks actually okay. It doesn't work great. Now what you could do to fix this partly is if I go ahead and find the curve, which is kind of, if I keep right clicking, it's kind of hard to find where that curve is actually located. But if I scaled, the issue is that the curve is now inside the mesh, which messes things up. So if I go ahead and like adjust that, it can kind of help a fair degree actually. So like, you know, now it looks a lot better than it did. Again, this crease doesn't get handled beautifully. Now what you could do to help, you could like try moving this up or down. And actually, I noticed the curve is, I don't know why the curve is getting bent on the y-axis. That's kind of weird. What I could do is apply the shrink wrap, maybe, and then that's SY0. Now it's 0 on the y-axis again, and then shrink wrap it again, and that might help it a bit to be, it's less bent on the y-axis, I think. Hard to say. Yeah. Anyways, let's see. So you could try playing around the plates. They don't handle sharp corners super well. Like this looks a lot better, obviously. Anyways, so again, extending it downwards, we can do it by extending it. The original object, it's getting the object which is along the curve, and which is shrink wrapped to this curvature, which spawns off the plates. We can either duplicate it a bunch of times. The other option is to have just duplicate the actual object and not increase the number of faces in edit mode. So what you just saw me do was increase the number of faces in edit mode. Now the alternative is to, let's say we select all this except for the this thing. Let's hide this thing. I select all these. I move it over on the y-axis. I could highlight, I could Shift D and move them all over. And why this could be an advantage, I've seen it work better for, here's a perfect case. For this thing, this is when I have all these faces are, it's basically duplicated in edit mode, right? So it's one long line of faces all in one object, which means that there's one curve modifier. That curve modifier right here, this curve modifier has to meet the widest point, which means that it's thinking that there's going to be faces right here to wrap to, and there's not, so that you have these extra faces. Now, you could clean these up. It wouldn't be at the end of the world, but if you want to be more exact, you see how there's 3 separate, or like 4 separate curve modifiers here? So like, you know, this thing has its own curve, which is as wide as it needs to be. And if I make it too wide, you'll see how there's extra faces that spawn, which we don't want to clean up probably. We could also make it too narrow if we wanted to, right? So you could like customize the width of this. So if we go back to our layer 3, like, so let's just take what we have, right? Let's go ahead and like hide this and duplicate all this and move it over. That's not working terribly well, actually. Probably because of the curve modifier. It is a curve modifier that's doing that. What would be easier actually is we just duplicate the whole thing. And if we do this, make this like a flat plane. Actually, I'm kind of already showed you guys, so I don't want to spend another 10 minutes demonstrating that. But point being, the actual process of making the plates is not that complicated. In summation, you have to create a flat face. You create your armor plate. The armor plate is parented to the flat face. The flat face has an array. The array then goes along a curve, which is shrink wrapped to your object. On top of shrink wrapping the curve to your object, you shrink wrap the flat faces to the object again. And because of that extra step of shrink wrapping the object, the flat face, which spawns the plates, and you're not shrink wrapping the plates themselves, it doesn't break the plates. Again, I could actually like go ahead and like, you know, let's go ahead and like ctrl+shift+A to make the plates real. Now, if I could go ahead and like ctrl+J them again, oopsies, what does happen there? Let's do ctrl+J, and now they're all one object. If I shrink wrap these plates to the surface, it's gonna mess them up. Yeah, we don't want that, do we? This is not what we're after. This is not useful, probably. So let's go ahead and undo that. Anyway, so I think you guys get the point. If you have any questions, feel free to answer them in the comments. What I would suggest is that, again, with all issues with curve modifier and arrays, and even mirror modifiers, these tend to stem from having a messed up origin. So if I take this plate right here, if I mess up its origin, oh wow, doesn't work, doesn't work, doesn't work. I could move its position in edit mode. That also doesn't work. I could move its position again in edit mode. That also doesn't work. So you get my point? It's bad news if you mess it up in edit mode, and even object mode as well. So that's kind of an issue. They can mess up. And the other thing that you can mess up is like, let's say the curve had like if you apply a location or something. Like now it's kind of, the origins are not aligned between the curve and the object that it's being bent, that is bent to the curve with the curve modifier. So not terribly complicated, but what I will say is that this method is not perfect. You do get like, you have to play around with these kind of overlapping faces in certain spots. And another thing is it doesn't handle sharp corners very well. I tried experimenting. Oh, my blender just crashed. Well, I guess we'll call that the end of the tutorial. I did experiment with sharp corners, and it doesn't handle them well. But for like an arm, it actually works quite well for an arm. Like an arm is not excessively, what's the term? You know, curvy. The curves are not too steep to be handled by this kind of process. Again, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask in the comments. Also, the blend file will be in the description. Should be uploaded within half an hour of this video going live. So, all right, guys, thank you for watching, and I wish you luck with this whole process. Bye.